Thank you, Madam President. It's an honor to appear before the court and to do so on behalf of the Republic of Armenia. I will be addressing why Azerbaijan's requests with respect to landmines do not satisfy the court's requirements for interim measures of protection. As a reminder, Azerbaijan's requests are essentially twofold: that Armenia be ordered to take all necessary steps to enable Azerbaijan to remove landmines laid in Azerbaijan's territory, and that Armenia be ordered to stop planting landmines in Azerbaijan's territory. I will begin with 6 points that serve as relevant factual background to Azerbaijan's 2 requests. First, landmines are defensive weapons that have been used in armed conflict for almost 2 centuries. As explained by the Encyclopedia Britannica, landmines are typically used to disrupt or prevent the massed attack of tanks and/or infantry. Tribunals such as the Eritrea-Ethiopia Claims Commission have noted that the defensive use of landmines, that landmines are used defensively, and their legality as a matter of customary international law. In other words, typically landmines are not laid for offensive purposes, and certainly not for the purpose of racial discrimination. Second, landmines were used by all the relevant parties, including Azerbaijan, during the first Nagorno-Karabakh War, principally in the period of 1991 to 1994. Thus, the problem of landmines in this geographic area is long-standing and has led to casualties from the 1990s onward. Moreover, the problem is not just landmines, but also explosive remnants of war, to include unexploded cluster munitions, of which Azerbaijan made extensive use in its aerial and artillery attacks during the first Nagorno-Karabakh War. Persons have been killed by these mines and ordnance from the 1990s right up to the outbreak of the conflict in September 2020, as was noted by opposing counsel this morning. And that fact must be kept in mind when considering similar civilian deaths occurring thereafter. In other words, it remains the case today that a civilian death that occurs in the region may well be the consequence of mines or ordnance from the first Nagorno-Karabakh War. Third, for years, Armenia has supported the idea of regulating and even banning the use of landmines, but only if its neighbors, including Azerbaijan, agree to the same. For that reason, after the adoption in 1997 of the Ottawa Treaty on Landmines, Armenia voted in favor of the 1998 UN General Assembly resolution calling upon all states to adhere to the Ottawa Treaty. By contrast, Azerbaijan did not vote in favor of that resolution. Indeed, Armenia said at the 2017 meeting of the states parties to the Ottawa Treaty that Armenia's full participation in the treaty is contingent upon a similar level of political commitment by other parties in the region. Alas, a similar commitment has not been forthcoming from Azerbaijan, such that today neither state is a party to the Ottawa Treaty, nor to Protocol 2 of the Convention on Conventional Weapons. Fourth, in the aftermath of the Nagorno-Karabakh War, Armenia strongly supported international efforts to remove landmines in Nagorno-Karabakh. Of particular note, Armenia supported the demining program funded by the US government and carried out by the UK-based non-profit organization called Halo Trust. Over the course of nearly 2 decades, Halo Trust cleared thousands of landmines and more than twice that of explosive ordnance from the areas where civilians were living. Yet it is important to note that Halo Trust only cleared mines that no longer play a political or military role, and therefore it did not work along the line of contact between the military forces. In other words, it was understood that certain mines had been laid for defensive purposes along the line of contact in the eastern and northern part of Nagorno-Karabakh, which were to be left in place given the military purpose that they served. I note that the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe monitored this line of contact throughout this time period, visiting the military forces arrayed on all sides, as is clear from Azerbaijan's own evidence. Further, Armenia worked closely with the OSCE on demining in Nagorno-Karabakh, but those efforts were effectively brought to an end by Azerbaijan in 2016. Fifth, this historic problem of landmines and explosive remnants of war was, of course, aggravated during the conflict that erupted in September 2020. What landmines, if any, were laid at that time is unclear. Yet the 2020 conflict certainly spawned a fresh set of explosive remnants of war, for which Azerbaijan, as the aggressor, is to blame. Indeed, a Human Rights Watch investigation in the densely populated areas of Nagorno-Karabakh uncovered, and I quote, numerous incidents in which Azerbaijan's forces used inherently indiscriminate cluster munitions and artillery rockets and other weapons that did not distinguish between military targets and civilian objects. Similarly, Amnesty International reported on Azerbaijan's use of such cluster munitions, finding that they pose a, and I quote, threat to civilians similar to anti-personal landmines and inflict suffering for civilian populations years after their use. Sixth, and finally, on the factual background, since the time of the trilateral statement of November 2020, there unfortunately has continued to be a very difficult military situation in Nagorno-Karabakh, with repeated violations of the ceasefire, notwithstanding the presence of the Russian peacekeeping forces. Military forces remain arrayed against each other in and around various parts of Nagorno-Karabakh, and minefields still exist that are important for military purposes. The border between Armenia and Azerbaijan is also a location of great concern, given statements by senior Azerbaijani officials, such as Azerbaijan's President Aliyev, about returning to places in Armenia, and given regular firing of weapons by Azerbaijan's armed forces across the border in incidents that have killed Armenian soldiers and civilians in Armenia. Of particular concern is the movement of Azerbaijan's troops into Armenia's sovereign territory since 12 May of this year, which has prompted calls such as from the French government, the Greek government, and the US government for Azerbaijan to pull back all forces immediately and cease further provocation. I mention this final factual point to highlight the situation today in Nagorno-Karabakh and along the Armenia-Azerbaijan border. It remains quite fraught. There are military forces deployed throughout the area, as well as peacekeeping forces, and military and security concerns remain paramount. As such, any order by the court that were to require Armenia to divulge information that would compromise the security of military forces in this area would be deeply problematic. Madam President, members of the court, I turn now to Armenia's legal arguments with respect to Azerbaijan's two requests, starting with the request for an order that Armenia help Azerbaijan to undertake demining in Azerbaijan's territory. Armenia is well aware of the dangers to civilians of landmines and unexploded ordnance. For that reason, when the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly on 27 September of this year adopted a resolution calling for Armenia to release all mine maps in its possession, Armenian deputies, without hesitation, voted in favor of the resolution. By contrast, as Professor Darjan recalled last week, all Azerbaijan deputies voted against the resolution, perhaps because it expressed deep concern about Armenian POWs and civilians detained by Azerbaijan. Perhaps because the resolution criticized the unacceptable racially intolerant overtones exacerbated by Azerbaijan's military trophies park, and perhaps because the resolution expressed deep concern about Armenian cultural heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh. But in any event, Armenia approaches the issue of landmines in good faith and is fully willing to cooperate with UN and regional systems, with non-governmental organizations, to promote the safety and well-being of the people in the region. Armenia has already provided maps to Azerbaijan. Moreover, Armenia's Prime Minister has publicly announced his willingness to bring to a meeting with Azerbaijan's president maps of minefields that do not separate the militaries of Armenia and Azerbaijan from one another, meaning maps that have a humanitarian significance rather than a military or civilian significance. And our agent today, before this court, confirmed that willingness when he said, "We stand ready to provide any more maps in our possession regarding minefields located behind the lines currently held by Azerbaijani armed forces, which now present solely humanitarian concerns. But that goodwill of Armenia is very different from saying that Armenia has a legal obligation to enable Azerbaijan to undertake mining activities, let alone an obligation arising under the CERD. Indeed, the extraordinary breadth of a purported obligation to enable another country to do something alone casts great doubt on the obligation's existence. Allow me to begin the legal analysis by indicating two problems in finding prima facie jurisdiction over this request. One problem concerns jurisdiction ratione materiae. The court found in the Gutter v. UAE case that such jurisdiction does not exist when the measure complained of by a party is based on adverse effects caused to nationals of a party, since discrimination under the CERD does not include discrimination based on nationality. Yet this request concerning demining is clearly based on alleged harmful effects to Azerbaijan nationals as a whole, not to persons of any particular ethnic origin. Professor Lowe this morning himself referred to the harm from landmines to, and he said, people of Azerbaijan. He didn't say harm to persons of Azerbaijani ethnicity. Indeed, if, as claimed in Azerbaijan's application, Azerbaijan is a multi-ethnic country, one that includes substantial numbers of Armenians, indeed a country comprised of over 50 ethnic groups, then a concern with demining in Azerbaijan necessarily is a concern for Azerbaijan nationals generally, and not to any particular ethnic group. Indeed, virtually every landmine victim listed in Azerbaijan's Annex 37 is listed as a citizen of the Republic of Azerbaijan, and none are listed as a member of an ethnic group. Another problem concerns jurisdiction ratione temporis. The CERD entered into force between the two parties in 1996. Yet, as I will soon explain, the only confirmed mine areas, according to Azerbaijan's application in this case, are along the line of contact between military forces that arose at the end of the first Nagorno-Karabakh war. If that's correct, then the confirmed mine areas were laid during and in the immediate aftermath of a war that ended in 1994. And thus, the alleged breach is dominantly, if not exclusively, based on acts or facts that took place before your temporal jurisdiction begins. Madam President, in case the court finds prima facie jurisdiction over this request, allow me to turn to whether there are any plausible CERD rights that can be linked to it. In Azerbaijan's request for provisional measures, it does not explain exactly why it thinks this request is plausibly linked to rights under the CERD. Instead, it just vaguely says that Armenia's policies and practices target Azerbaijanis for discriminatory treatment falling within the scope of the CERD. The presentations by Professor Lowe and Ms. Amirfar this morning seem to focus on an overall practice of what Azerbaijan calls ethnic cleansing that began well before your temporal jurisdiction, of which the issue of handing over maps is the latest chapter. But the exact policy or practice of Armenia still remains unclear. Is it an Armenian practice of laying mines starting in the 1990s and up until the trilateral statement? Or is it a practice relating to a single alleged incident of mining since the trilateral statement? Or is it a policy by Armenia of being willing to meet to discuss, among other things, which maps Armenia may possess relating to mines that are not pertinent to military defense? Whatever Azerbaijan's view is as to the Armenian policy or practice, arguing a plausible connection to CERD rights is rather difficult given a simple fact. Landmines, by their nature, do not engage in ethnic discrimination when it comes to the victims that they claim. It matters not to the mine who or what steps on it. In fact, the landmines and explosive remnants remaining from the past 3 decades of armed conflict in this area have harmed Armenians, Azerbaijanis, and others alike, sometimes in the fields they farm, and sometimes in their streets and gardens. Indeed, sometimes the same explosion harms persons of multiple backgrounds. For example, in November of last year, a landmine in Nagorno-Karabakh killed an Azerbaijani officer, wounded several ethnic Armenian officials, and wounded a Russian peacekeeper. Clearly, the mine made no distinction as to the ethnicity or nationality of its victims. All were affected without any such discrimination. Professor Lowe himself this morning said mines are indiscriminate, as has Azerbaijan's Commissioner for Human Rights and Ombudsperson, who has stressed that mines are indiscriminate by nature and that mines have indiscriminate effects. Yet I wish to reiterate that such explosions are not just the product of mines. For example, earlier this year, an ethnic Armenian woman found 32 unexploded shells in her garden in Kakhartsi, which is about 16 miles east of Stepanakert, from one of the cluster bombs that was used in the fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh. In that instance, the cluster bombs were clearly dropped by Azerbaijan, which uses Israeli-made cluster munitions that are distinctive for their pink ribbons. No doubt others have found such shells and perhaps mistaken them for mines. In fact, I note that the photographs presented by Azerbaijan in its Annex 36, which contain many duplicates of the same scene, are actually often of unexploded ordnance, not of mines. This is not to say that Azerbaijan citizens in Nagorno-Karabakh have not been harmed by landmines or explosive remnants of war. They have. And that loss of life is deeply, deeply regrettable. Unfortunately, Azerbaijan's media report that since the trilateral statement, many Azerbaijan citizens attempting to visit areas in Nagorno-Karabakh do so in violation of Azerbaijan's law. Apparently, in many cases, these individuals traveled on uncleared roads or cut across open fields to avoid Azerbaijan's military checkpoints. But the point is that Armenia has never used mines to target persons of Azerbaijani ethnic origin, not before the armed conflict in 2020, not during that armed conflict, and not thereafter. There is zero evidence in the record of any such intent, no matter what you hear from counsel on the other side. Any speculation along those lines is just that, sheer speculation with no evidentiary foundation. You cannot point to a photograph of a mine sitting in a field and simply say, aha, it was planted specifically and deliberately for the purpose or effect of racial discrimination. Indeed, it would be very odd for military authorities in control of a territory to lay mines throughout that territory based on a belief that at some unknown point in the future, they would lose control of some of that territory, and on a belief that persons of a specific ethnicity would then come into the territory and would be uniquely harmed by such mines. And it would be equally odd in the heat of a sudden military attack to spend precious time laying mines for anything other than defensive maneuvers. Indeed, I sadly note that a reason why the trilateral statement provided for the return of the bodies of dead soldiers was because retreating forces did not even have the time to evacuate the bodies of fallen comrades. It's simply not credible to think that they ignored their brothers in arms so as to hatch a devious plot of ethnic discrimination. So why would mines have been laid in areas in and around Nagorno-Karabakh? Certainly it was not for the purpose or effect of racial discrimination. It was for the purpose of military defense. And that is clear from Azerbaijan's own pleadings before the court, especially if one looks at that figure 1 from Azerbaijan's request for provisional measures, which counsel for Azerbaijan placed before you this morning. You see now figure 1 on your screen. We are told by Azerbaijan that figure 1 is a map produced by Azerbaijan's Mine Action Agency. Assuming for the sake of argument that there is some accuracy to this map, what does it tell us about the laying of mines in this area? Well, notice first the title of the map. It is referring not just to mines, but also to unexploded ordnance. Thus, while the legend of the map says in various places mines or minefields, this appears to be a map that is concerned with both mines and unexploded ordnance. And typically in the aftermath of a battle, the number of unexploded ordnance will vastly exceed the number of mines. And that's a fact worth bearing in mind when considering the dots on this map. Moreover, that ordinance is due to actions by all sides in the conflict. Let's not pretend that this map is showing exclusively conduct by Armenia. But let's assume this map is, to some extent, showing the location of mines. Where is it that Azerbaijan says that the location of mines is confirmed and is most concentrated? Well, it is that thick red line, which is clearly following the line of contact between opposing militaries that existed for some 3 decades. Any mines located in that area were clearly laid by opposing sides for defensive purposes. Azerbaijan's Mine Action Agency, in Azerbaijan's Annex 32, characterizes the mines in this area as, and I quote, traditional military doctrine barrier defenses, which exist alongside tank ditches, large berms, and barbed wire entanglements. So what these confirmed mines are, they are traditional military defense mines, not some crafty form of ethnic discrimination. Even the website of Azerbaijan's Military Trophies Park refers to this line as part of the, quote, enemy's defensive wall. Well, what about the mines in other areas away from this 3 decades old line of contact? Well, on this map, the areas shaded in orange and yellow are relevant, according to Azerbaijan. Look at the legend of the map. It indicates that for these colors, the existence of minefields is suspected, which means that it is not certain they exist. Moreover, for both the orange and yellow areas, the legend refers to them not just as minefields, but as minefields and battlefields. And battlefields, apparently meaning that they suspect that there are mines in these areas because these areas were battlefields. And please look even more closely and notice that virtually all of these suspected minefields and battlefields in the yellow and orange areas fall along lines, a classic indication that these were further lines of contact as military forces are positioning and repositioning themselves, such as during a 6-week retreat. Indeed, Azerbaijan's own Mine Action Agency in Annex 32 says it characterizes these locations as, and I quote, military positions with patterned mine lines, end of quote. Azerbaijan's Annex 36, also referred to by Council this morning, does not take things much further. At best, it shows a handful of mines have been found by Azerbaijan in areas at a distance from the line of contact. Yet those mines easily may have been laid for defensive purposes, including in agricultural fields, by retreating forces. Indeed, while the Mine Action Agency concludes that they were deliberately laid, that conclusion is consistent with them being laid for defensive and not racial reasons. So in general, we submit that it makes no sense to say that any mines confirmed along this thick red line of contact, or mines suspected elsewhere on battlefields, were laid as a policy or practice of racial discrimination. They were laid for defensive purposes. There's no other way to look at it. And if a belligerent has to lay mines in farmland while retreating so as to slow down an advancing belligerent, that is no less done for the purpose of lawful self-defense. And it equally makes no sense to say that sharing or not sharing of any existing maps of such minefields is some clever scheme of racial discrimination that somehow violates some provision of the CERD. This is especially the case if, as Azerbaijan says, it is allowing the return of displaced persons regardless of their national or ethnic origin, so that someday Armenian and Azerbaijanis will live side by side. As such, we submit there are no plausible CERD rights being advanced that are linked to this request. Madam President, members of the court, Azerbaijan has also requested a provisional measure that Armenia shall immediately seize and desist from planting or promoting or facilitating the planting of landmines in Azerbaijan's territory. I note that this second request seems directed solely at the planting of landmines near the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan and not elsewhere. Azerbaijan's request is based on an incorrect factual claim. As was stated by our agent this afternoon to the court, Armenia is not planting landmines in the territory of the Republic of Azerbaijan or the Republic of Artsakh. Because Azerbaijan's factual assertion about transboundary laying of mines is incorrect, it's no surprise that Azerbaijan's evidence of any such conduct is severely lacking. Indeed, the only factual basis for Azerbaijan's request is a single incident that purportedly occurred on 27 May of this year. According to Azerbaijan, on that day, it caught Armenian military forces attempting to plant landmines just across the border in Azerbaijan's territory. As we explained last week, Azerbaijan has its facts wrong. In reality, it was Azerbaijan's military forces that crossed into undisputed Armenian territory on that day and unlawfully abducted 6 Armenian soldiers. And unfortunately, Azerbaijan military units continue to be present in such territory even today. But even if one were to assume arguendo the facts as asserted by Azerbaijan, would that single incident of alleged cross-border mining plausibly implicate rights under the CERD? According to Azerbaijan, these were Armenian soldiers who tried to mine the supply routes leading to the positions of the Azerbaijani army on the border, and who were then surrounded, neutralized, and detained by the Azerbaijan military. In other words, these were not Armenian soldiers attempting some devious plot of racial discrimination. They were, on Azerbaijan's own account, trying to secure a military objective, which was to defend Armenia against Azerbaijan military operations on the border with Armenia. Even on Azerbaijan's account, there are no plausible CERD rights at issue. In any event, we submit Azerbaijan's request is clearly moot and presents no issue of urgency. Our agent said clearly to the court this afternoon in his opening statement that Armenia is not planting any landmines in Azerbaijan or Artsakh. And moreover, he assured the court that Armenia respects and abides by its obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force under Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. In light of those statements, the request advanced by Azerbaijan no longer has any object, if it ever did, and it follows that the issuance by the court of such a preliminary measure would have no raison d'etre. Madam President, this concludes my presentation. I thank the honorable members of the court for their kind attention